Senhoras e senhores, muito boa tarde. Essa atividade tem a previsão de 45 minutos de duração. Cada panelista falará por 15 minutos e, ao final, teremos 15 minutos para debates. Nosso primeiro convidado é o senhor Lawrence Reed, que é economista e presidente da FI, que é a fabulosa Foundation for Economic Education, com sede em Irvington, Nova York. Com a palavra, Larry.
Thank you very much, Elio. Thanks also to the Institute and to the Fórum, the Liberty Forum, and to all of you ladies and gentlemen. Having been to Spain and Portugal and Brazil many times, and many countries in the world that have been greatly influenced by those three countries, I'm well aware that some people famously say that Spanish is Portuguese spoken badly, and that Portuguese is Spanish spoken badly. Well, for the next 15 minutes or so, I think you are about to hear English spoken badly. Even though the subject for this panel is freedom on the web, my focus will be on a larger picture of free trade, with the web being a component of that. Economists understand, as I think a number of other people do too, that in human society, people benefit from cooperation. We are social beings. There is so much more to be gained by finding ways to work in harmony with other people than there are to be gained by fighting them or living in isolation from other people. And when we learn that principle, some rather magical things begin to happen. First, people begin to specialize. They discover that they can do some things better or cheaper than other things. This specialization is not random, it's not accidental. It's based upon what economists call comparative advantage. We tend to specialize in the production of those things in which we have a comparative advantage, that we can produce at lower opportunity costs compared to others. And then when we learn that and practice that, we must engage in exchange. And an important principle of that is that both sides to a free trade benefit. It's an elemental and eternal principle of trade, that as long as it's free, both sides to each transaction regard that what they're getting is worth more than what they're giving up. So that trade is every bit as productive, in some sense, as production itself. Now, this is true whether you're talking about neighbors who live across the street from each other, or whether you're talking about people who live across state lines or province lines, provincial lines, whether they speak different languages or live across international boundaries. And because it's true for individuals, it must be true for that collection of individuals that we call a nation. Most things that we rely upon in trade, we could produce ourselves, I suppose, in almost every case. The United States could produce its own coffee under glass in the state of Michigan, perhaps. And Brazil could perhaps produce all of its own electrical equipment or its electronics. But to do so means that the coffee and the electronics would probably be not as good and would probably be produced at far higher cost than is the case with international trade. Why is trade good? A lot of reasons. But an important one is that trade cuts costs. And in a world of limited resources, whatever allows or encourages us to reduce the costs of the inputs to a productive process has the effect of increasing overall wealth. One of the great virtues of the web is that it cuts costs. It cuts the costs of information, the costs of warehousing, the costs of other transactional costs. It allows the new and the small an opportunity to compete with the large and the old. It creates and empowers entrepreneurship, which yields opportunity, innovation, employment, and other positive benefits. You may have heard the famous example of the man on a deserted island. He's the only one there. He has a lot of things to do. And at the moment, he's concentrating on building a house. He has to cut down trees and fashion logs to make a home. And at that moment, partway through this process, he discovers that the waves have washed up onto shore an already pre-cut log of the precise dimensions that he needs. What should he do? Should he take this cheap, in fact, no-cost import and put it to use and be thankful that that means more time and more resources available for other things? Or should he kick it back into the ocean and regard that that action of kicking it back and not accepting it would in fact create new employment for himself? I think the answer is obvious. You may have also heard the famous example of Frederic Bastiat, one of the best economists that France has ever produced. In the first part of the 19th century, he wrote, among many other things, something called the Petition of the Candle Makers. And in this petition, those who are making candles are requesting something of the king. They're speaking in this petition of a merciless competitor who floods the shores with competition. And as a result, the candle makers sell far fewer candles than if this competition were kept out. It turns out he's talking about the sun, and sunlight in particular. And the fact is that because the sun provides sunlight during daylight hours, at no cost to us, means that people buy fewer candles because of that import of sunlight. And so the candle makers say, how can we ever compete in a market in which the sun provides competition at no cost? And so they ask the king to impose a rule that requires that all people paint their windows black. That would have the effect of keeping this no-cost import out. But it would, of course, cause havoc and higher costs throughout the economy. It's always to our advantage to take the low-cost or the no-cost import over the higher-cost domestically produced product. So trade is good, and in our world of limited resources, the cost-cutting it permits is a good thing. The opposite of trade, protectionist devices such as tariffs and quotas, is bad precisely because it increases costs and reduces choice. Have you ever noticed that trade is a natural and spontaneous thing? It's what happens when you leave people alone. It doesn't require a decree of the king or the emperor. All it requires is for people to be left alone, and it occurs. Protectionism is force. It's intervention. It's an outside agency intruding upon the free choice of market participants. And I think for that reason alone we should be suspicious of it. Take the candle maker example. Suppose that the king had in fact ordered windows painted black. The effects, of course, would be profound. The candle makers would probably prosper. But you would not be thorough in your thinking if it didn't go much beyond the candle makers themselves. Consumers would suffer. And because consumers would suffer, those that they would otherwise have been able to purchase from but now can't because of the waste of resources on additional candles would suffer as well. In international trade, closing the door to imports means closing the door to exports. How can someone sell here if they cannot? How can overseas people sell here if they can't buy here, and vice versa? Protectionism is like painting your windows black. Erecting barriers to the development of the internet is like painting your windows black. We should think of the web as truly an information highway, a facilitator of trade and relationships across political boundaries. We should think of assaults on it that would slow it down as assaults on trade and on wealth creation. It is a manifestation of new freedoms and new ways to cut costs that technology has blessed us with, much like the log that washed up on our shore in the example I gave you. So think of these things as bound up in one big economic blessing: freedom, trade, movement of goods, movement of capital, movement of investment funds, movement of people, and the internet and other cost-saving technologies. These are not to be feared or shunned or attacked, but to be celebrated and embraced. So where does Brazil stand in the world on issues of trade and economic freedom? Forgive me in advance. I don't mean to sound like I'm preaching to Brazil. You've made remarkable, enviable progress in many ways in the last decade. You avoided many of the policy mistakes that brought on the last recession. and you've recovered from it sooner than we in the United States have. I feel very awkward in lecturing another country when I come from one that is practicing some of the worst fiscal and monetary policies in the world today. That includes our bad policies in the US of agriculture subsidies, our government's reluctance to adhere to calls for freer trade or abide by WTO rulings. The Heritage Foundation and the Wall Street Journal have produced annually for a number of years an index of economic freedom, and it ranks 183 countries on a scale of 0 to 100 in each of these categories: business freedom, trade freedom, fiscal freedom, government spending, monetary freedom, investment freedom, financial freedom, property rights, freedom from corruption, and labor freedom. Brazil's overall economic freedom score is 56.3. The global average of these 183 countries is 59.7. So Brazil is actually slightly below the global average, and its economy ranks 113th freest in the world. That means that 112 countries are economically freer than Brazil, only 70 are less free. Consider a few areas. The state's role in the economy here is heavy and in some respects increasing. The efficiency and overall quality of government services remains poor despite high government spending as a percentage of GDP, according to the Heritage Foundation. Barriers to entrepreneurial activity include burdensome taxes, inefficient regulation, poor access to long-term financing, and a rigid labor market. Business freedom. In spite of some progress, organizing new investment and production remain cumbersome and bureaucratic in Brazil. It's costly and time-consuming to launch or to close a business. Trade freedom. Brazil's weighted average tariff rate was 7.6% in 2009. Import bans and restrictions, market access barriers and services, high tariffs, border taxes and fees, restrictive regulatory and licensing rules, subsidies, complex customs procedures, all of these things add to the cost of trade. Government spending. In the most recent year, total expenditures, including consumption and transfer payments, was about 41% of GDP, which is quite high. Investment freedom. Foreign investors are granted national treatment, but foreign investment here is restricted in several industries. Bureaucracy and administration are not transparent. They are burdensome, complex, and subject to corruption. Legal disputes here can be time-consuming. Labor freedom. I've learned some things today that suggest that there's even more room for progress here than I first thought. Brazil has rigid and outmoded labor regulations that undermine employment and productivity growth. The non-salary cost of employing a worker is high, and dismissing a redundant employee can be costly. I know that Brazil's extraordinarily high interest rates have caused problems for certain domestic industries, even as these high interest rates have spurred a huge inflow of capital investment, which itself is a good thing in the long run. But in any event, fixing the problem of the high value of the real by imposing new costs and taxes on trade must in the long run be counterproductive. The best way to address that problem is by addressing the other issues that have been raised in the Freedom Index that I touched on a moment ago. Issues over which you have more control because they are purely domestic. Things like cutting spending. There's no reason for the state to claim 40% of anyone's life, or 50%, or 60%. One of the eternal principles of economics and history and of government is that government has nothing to give anybody except what it first takes from somebody. And a government that's big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take away everything you have. Liberating the labor market. Given Brazil's extraordinarily rigid labor market, it would seem to me that addressing that issue could bear far more fruit in the long run for economic growth and for trade than intervening further with more government spending or higher taxes. In short, what must be done is to push Brazil up the list of nations with economic freedom, not down the list. Allow freedom, free trade, and a vibrant free web to cut costs and boost Brazil. As the French philosopher once said, Montesquieu, nations are cultivated not by their resources, but by their liberties. Thank you very much.
Agradecemos a participação inicial do Sr. Lawrence Reed. E imediatamente ouviremos o Sr. Tyler Cowen, que é professor de Economia na Universidade George Mason, autor de vários livros, escreve regularmente para a mídia popular, incluindo The New York Times, The Washington Post e The Wilson Quarterly. É diretor do Centro Mercatus. Com a palavra, o Sr. Tyler Cowen.
Let's start with a quick quiz. Of all of the countries which have a presence on the internet, which is the most interested in social networking? The answer is actually Brazil. Question 2. Of all the countries with the presence on the internet, which country is most interested in Twitter? The answer is Brazil. This is the good news. I would like to paint a slightly more optimistic portrait than what you heard from Larry, because there are two ways that any nation can become more free, much more free, without repealing any law, without having to rewrite the Constitution, or without having to elect some favored candidate. And those two ways are, first, international trade, and second, the internet. If you get more trade and you get more internet, your country will be more free, because those are areas of economic activity which are relatively hard for the government to regulate. What I would like to do in my talk is just put forward six simple propositions about how the internet will promote liberty in the present and also in our future. So let me start and go down the list of 6. The first is that most of what is on the internet, the content, is quite unregulated to an unprecedented degree. Maybe the channel that you get the internet with is regulated, but the internet itself, most of that content is covered by free speech laws, but it's a lot more than speech. It's social connections, it's education, it's entertainment, it's helping you define who you are, it's forming friendships, it's telling your mother what you ate for breakfast. And that's pretty much unregulated. This sector of the economy is growing. There was a research paper written in 2006 by an economist named Austin Goolsbee. And in 2006, he estimated the value of the internet to consumers was about 2% of the national economy in the United States. But that was 2006. I think right now it's more like 4 to 5%. I'm looking forward to a world within my lifetime where it is 15 to 20% of the value of economic activity being conducted essentially over a medium which is relatively unregulated. There is a lot of room for the internet to grow. 2 sessions ago, I heard these 2 fellows from newspapers, the guy from Rio and the other from Venezuela. Neither of them mentioned that newspapers will die. In the United States, we will probably be left with 2 or 3 major newspapers. Newspapers are not making money anymore. News over the internet will take their place. If I take an iPad, my iPad, this year, this is like a mini computer. It makes me like a cyborg in a way. I now carry around my iPad all day long, almost every day, to be connected. So the internet will grow, and that means the less regulated sphere of the economy will grow. The internet is also an area where unlicensed amateurs can have a big impact. Who started Facebook? Mark Zuckerberg. Who was he? He was a kid at Harvard. We all know this from the movie. So there's something close to free entry into producing content. A lot of things can happen. The legal barriers are not so strong. Second point I want to make about the internet, and this has to do with blogs in particular, what we call the blogosphere. The blogosphere accelerates all intellectual battles. It speeds up the debate. I think of the blogosphere as like a very efficient time machine. It used to be in economics, when we had a debate, someone would publish an article, there would be a response a year later, there'd be something in a magazine, a year after that, the New York Times would write about it. It would take a long time to get to the truth. Today, we have these debates very quickly. They occur within days, sometimes within hours. Someone puts up an economic argument on a blog. Someone responds. 5 other people respond to that. 10 other people respond to that. Usually within about a day and a half. So if there's any intellectual fight, any intellectual question, if you want to know which aspects of the current Democratic or Republican Party platforms will stand up, which make sense, which don't, which part of Paul Ryan's plans might work, which parts might not, you don't have to wait years, you don't have to wait months, you have to wait about a day or two, and you learn that by going to the blogosphere. And this is a way in which our education and also our entertainment is enormously accelerated in a progressive manner. Third point about how the internet relates to liberty. I view the internet as the final collapse of the European model of high culture. Think of the classical European model. It's about large-scale cultural outputs, operas, buildings, tapestries, enjoyed by elites, written up in canons, visited by tourists, costing great expense. All of that is still there, but it's not so culturally central anymore. What the internet does is it changes the whole ballgame. You can consume culture at any pace you want, any time you want, whether it's TV shows, movies, music, texting your friends, reading Amazon, our Amazon, not your Amazon, Amazon.com, reading Amazon to order books. You see people, they're watching TV, they're cruising the web, they're texting their friend, playing music all at the same time. So culture has become some kind of flow. It has become more interior. It has become more individual. It has become more subjective. It is more individualistic. It is harder to regulate. It has a lot less to do with government subsidies. But at the same time, this individualistic culture, it is not lonely. It is a very connected culture. It is connected through Orkut, Facebook, Twitter, texting, cell phones, however it is you're communicating with your family and your friends. There's a very good musical group. Maybe some of you have heard of them. They're called, forgive my pronunciation, Os Mutantes, the mutants. This is really the paradigm for the culture of the future. And as I understand Brazilian culture, this has been a kind of shifting mutant culture for a long time. So I think Brazilian culture and ideas and creativity are actually very well suited for this new world. And to go back to our quiz, when we see that Brazil, in percentage terms, is the #1 country on social networks, when we see that Brazil, in percentage terms, is the #1 country on Twitter, this is reflecting Os Mutantes aspect of this culture. Always morphing, always ambitious, trying to grasp far beyond what is there, and getting somewhere with that. So collapse of the European model of culture, I think, will be a boon, a benefit for the ideas of what I call the New World, Brazil, the United States, the other countries of this hemisphere. My fourth point, the internet is a sector or a medium which is relatively hard to tax. Of course, there is a lot of business done over the internet, and that business can be taxed. Not all of it gets taxed, but it can be taxed. But so much of the internet, it's about fun, it's about leisure, it's about reading, it's about watching video clips, It's about chatting with your family and your friends. So the leisure sector of our economy, our economies, in the last 10 years have become much, much more productive because of the internet. And what does every economist know about leisure? Every economist knows that leisure is about the hardest economic output to tax. If you just want to sit on a chair and do nothing, it's very hard for the government to tax you. If you've already paid for your internet connection, you just want to go to YouTube and watch a clip, Gilberto Gil, whatever it is, Pato Fu, it is very hard for the government to tax that. So now if the internet is a few percent of the value of the national economy, and imagine in the future it becomes 10, 15, 20% of the value of the national economy, that's a bigger chunk of happiness, of welfare, of economics, of exchange, which is hard to tax. It's determined by consumers. There's relatively free entry. It's hard to regulate, and most of it is covered being some kind of free speech. So the countries which are advancing on the internet, they don't always think of it in these terms, but they're actually engaged in a very sophisticated form of tax evasion, because leisure is hard to tax. Think of the internet as being the ultimate form of cheap fun. Admittedly, today, not everyone affords the actual connection, but once you have the connection, at the margin, the extra you pay for more fun, that is basically a price of zero. Now let me turn to two more complicated questions when I talk about how the internet will interact with liberty. And my fifth point has to do with the internet and job creation. What we have seen so far in the history of the internet is that so far the internet creates fewer jobs than a lot of previous technological revolutions. So let's just take a few of the most famous internet companies. If you take Facebook, Facebook employs about 1,400 people as of last year. For a company that is world famous, this is remarkably small. If you take Twitter, a very, very famous company, Twitter employs only a few hundred people. Google employs more at 20,000. But again, if you compare this, say, to Ford or General Motors during their years of most rapid growth, it is still a small number. So we have something funny happening, and here I am talking about the United States. We have a new technological revolution. It is wonderful for consumers. It is wonderful for free speech. It is wonderful for deregulation. It is wonderful for liberty, but it is not quite wonderful for jobs. And there is a very distinct turning point when you look at the numbers, when you look at the years. If you take the United States economy from 1995 to 1999, the sectors that had the highest productivity created a lot of jobs. That's the pattern we usually expect. When you look at the years 2001 to 2004 in the United States, we had some decent productivity gains, but in those same sectors, the number of jobs declined. So we're in a funny intermediate point where the internet has not yet completely revolutionized our economies. If you go back, you look at economic history, electricity was around for a long time before we built our economy around electricity. Automobiles were possible for a long time before we built our economies around automobiles. People forget it can take 40 to 50 years to really fully integrate a new technology. Right now, so often we use the internet as something like a glorified, easier mail order catalog, like Amazon.com. And that's great. I love that. But the internet can be so much more. We are not yet at the point where we organize our entire economy around the existence of the internet. When that is the case, the internet will create many more jobs. But right now in the United States, we are at this funny intermediate point where the internet has not been good for job creation, and the United States is in an economic dilemma because our job market is very weak and our major technological advance is not really helping with jobs. This is a potential problem for liberty in my country. In Brazil, as I understand it, this is not yet a problem. Brazil is growing very rapidly in ways which the United States is not. In Brazil, you have this notion, I call it low-hanging fruit. This is a metaphor. In Brazil, in some places, you can interpret it quite literally, low-hanging fruit. But low-hanging fruit is the notion of economic advances. All you have to do is do it, and it will work. To bring different ideas from the US and Europe to Brazil, it is happening. There are so many ideas that have come in, other ideas that will come. They only need to come, and they will work. That is low-hanging fruit. Brazil right now is still exploiting low-hanging fruit. It has a long way to go. The United States has nothing comparable. We have no easy gains that we can simply take from somewhere and create jobs with. My final point about the internet and liberty, it has to do with labor markets. And this also, again, is a little tricky. What we are seeing in some countries, including the United States, are very distinct or very differentiated labor market outcomes. In this sense, the United States is becoming a little more like Brazil. For instance, students who graduate from college, they tend to do either very well or not so well at all. The middle has become somewhat thinner. We have a phrase in economics. We call this the polarization of labor market outcomes. People do very well or not so well, and the middle is somewhat thinner. And I think there's a pretty fundamental question which determines, do people do very well or much less well? And this is the question. Your job, your labor, your intelligence, your skills, do they work with computers and the internet? Do they complement computers and the internet? Do they augment the power of computers and the internet? If the answer is yes, probably you will do very well. If the answer is no, that what you do, what you know, what you create is competing against computers and the internet, then probably your outcome will be a much poorer one. So very rapidly, labor markets need to make this adjustment. Education needs to make this adjustment. We need to train the next generation in a very new and different way. We need to train people so that their outputs, their skills, their creations are augmented by the power of computers and the internet. And this is perhaps the biggest challenge facing the United States today, and it is probably a challenge facing Brazil as well. Because both of our countries have educational systems of uneven quality. Some parts are very good, some parts are not so good. This is becoming a bigger problem than it was before. It's not a problem for everyone. For a lot of people, things are going great. But the need for educational reform in both of our countries has become more pressing. Because we need a society with a relatively thick middle. We need most individuals to be at the point where their skills are augmented by computers and the internet. And to get to that point, which will help us move to a better politics, a less regulated economy, and a freer society, we all need better institutions of education. Anyway, those are my remarks for today. Thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here. Thank you.
Agradecemos a participação do Sr. Tyler Cohen e a seguir daremos início à sessão de perguntas e respostas. Queria pedir para vocês enviarem algumas perguntas. Eu acho que já comecei a receber umas perguntas aqui. E eu vou começar com uma uma pergunta minha. It's about trade and the internet. And maybe with the exception of books, anything Brazilians import, either individually, as individuals, or as through companies and trading companies, are subject to taxes that vary from 50% to 150% in total, very many different taxes. We have Apple and Steve Jobs saying that they don't want to come to Brazil and produce here, neither their software business, iTunes and etc., app stores, because of the huge regulations and taxes that we have in Brazil. So let me start with Larry. You mentioned Bastiat, that is known for stressing what we can see, what we see, and what we don't see. So what we see are all these taxes that Brazilians have to pay. We don't see the consequences of those taxes and regulations. So, Larry, what do you think are the consequences for Brazilians, individuals, for their welfare, and for the economy as a whole of these government policies?
Well, you're right, Elio, you have a very high tax burden here. But let's keep in mind that in any country, you tax because you spend. And there's no amount of excessive spending that can be financed by any kind of tax that is either fair or not burdensome. So the problem is primarily a spending problem. Even as high as taxes are in Brazil, the Brazilian government spends all of that revenue and a lot more on top of that. And as all of you well know, you've got a deficit problem, much as we do in the United States, perhaps even worse. But the problem is primarily spending. If you bring it down, you can bring taxes down. As long as taxes are high, you will affect incentives. The more you tax work or investment or thrift or the movement of people and capital, the less of those things you will get, because people ultimately are creatures of incentives and disincentives. And time and again, we've been witness to this important lesson in economic experience, and that is that those nations which tax enterprise the heaviest in the long run tend to do the poorest in economic output, performance, employment, and almost by any other measure. So bring down spending, then bring down taxes, and then you can enjoy the kinds of sustainable economic growth that will come from entrepreneurship and innovation and market forces, not government spending.
Tyler?
I like to say that Brazil is the one country where large numbers of people still believe in mercantilism. Most of all, your politicians. My politicians practice mercantilism, but I think they do so with a guilty manner. They don't believe in it so much. But here's the good news and the bad news. A lot of developing economies, including Brazil, they have quite an inefficient system of income taxation. A lot of people don't pay their income taxes. As countries become more middle class, and this has happened in many, many countries, as a country becomes more middle class, income and consumption as sources of taxation rise, and the economies move away from various forms of inefficient taxation on trade, on retail activity, and on innovation. And with the middle class on the rise in Brazil today, the most likely outcome is that you will all end up paying higher income taxes, boo, but you will face lower taxes on a lot of these distortions and innovations. And on net, that will be a beneficial exchange.
Okay. Tyler, you mentioned that the internet is not creating as much jobs today, and that may be a potential problem in the US. But I'm again going to use the Bastiat analogy, which is if we take into account only what we see in the internet, the jobs created by the internet and technology, they may be few, but we also see around the industry of the internet, in the infrastructure supporting the internet, in the commerce and the leisure that supports the internet, we see much more jobs. We have learned since Adam Smith that what creates growth it's not necessarily jobs by themselves, but capital accumulation and the division of labor. And of course, for example, in the US, in Detroit, we may see fewer jobs in Detroit, but we may see higher jobs in some other parts of the economy. How do you see that, that view?
Well, I think the internet creates a lot of jobs for some groups of people. And that's basically people whose labor can be augmented in value by working with computers and the internet. There was one recent study, it found that the wage gains of the internet, they were concentrated in about 6% of the counties of the United States. A lot of the problem here is a political economy problem. People demand, as voters, something close to free employment, to full employment, and if they don't get it, they tend to vote for bad policies. When an economy has new innovations, sometimes those innovations create a lot of jobs and sometimes they don't. Right now we're at this funny intermediate position where the internet has destroyed some number of jobs, say people who work as clerks, filing papers, eliminated jobs in that middle tier, and the new job creation has been slower for people who are in that thick middle, the middle of the income distribution. So it's not that there are no new jobs, but the new jobs and wage gains are going to people who are very well educated. And in the longer run, that is one factor that makes me slightly worried.
Okay. We have a question here from Nicole, and it's for Larry. How can Brazil decrease the protectionism without affecting companies and jobs for Brazilians?
There's no question that whenever you change the regime of tariffs, quotas, a whole apparatus of protectionism, there will be industries that had previously benefited from protectionism that will be forced to adjust. That's inevitable. It's the same as saying the fact that you have the freedom to buy from him instead of him will adversely affect whoever you choose not to buy from. That's not an argument in favor of keeping things as in the status quo or bestowing any special privileges upon this or that producer. It's an argument for allowing maximum flexibility at all time in markets so that when adjustments do happen, they don't have to be sudden and massive, as you sometimes have when you change a very bad policy and make it a good one. So there's no question there will be some hardship, but you have to consider the long run. What is the healthiest route for any economy? And I think it's been shown time and time and again that the economies of the world that are the most open, where consumers have the greatest choices, where competition is at its maximum, where nobody enjoys special privileges at the expense of their competition or consumers, those are the economies that will tend to do the best. And protecting an economy from competition or from the free choices of consumers who might prefer something else is not a prescription for economic progress. It's a prescription for, in the long run, fewer choices, higher costs, and lower real wages.
Tyler, I noticed that you seem to be optimistic about the future of the internet as an agent for change and for increasing liberty and prosperity. And we have seen here at the Fórum this debate between the cyber utopians on one side and cyber skeptics at the other. Rodrigo Constantino has given a lecture arguing for the cyber skepticism, saying that the internet may be used by the government to find out who the dissidents are, to divert the discussions by paid agents of the government. For example, in China, we know that 250,000 people are paid by the Communist Party to divert the discussions in blogs, and that's known as the 50-cent party. I've recently been to Burma 2 months ago, Myanmar, which is called today. And in Myanmar, you cannot have an email account. Cell phones don't work. Roaming doesn't work. And so people, of course, they have email accounts. They have a lot of cyber cafes that people go. But at the cyber cafes, the government mandates that you have cameras all the time. And every 5 minutes, the cyber cafes have to send print screens to the government of every computer. So given that cyber skeptical view, how do you conflate that with your cyber utopian view?
I'm a cyber optimist. I wouldn't say I'm a cyber utopian. If I look at the US economy, the problem sectors are the regulated ones: healthcare, education, and government. The internet is doing fine. When the demonstrations came to Egypt a few months ago, the first thing the ruling powers tried to do was to shut down the internet. It didn't work, but I think it shows that on net, the internet is doing much more to support liberty than to hurt it. Take even the case of China. China does more by far to regulate and control the internet than any other government except perhaps North Korea or Cuba. China goes to great lengths. Partly they succeed, but still information about the Chinese government leaks out onto the internet. There are shadow sites. There are other ways to access the information. And if you consider the Chinese government is not a democracy, but they care very, very closely what their citizens think. The Chinese government reads the internet because they care so much what their citizens think. And to some extent, they try to deliver economic benefits to those same citizens. So even in China, which is about the most heavily regulated internet, I think on net, the internet is a considerable force for liberty and not for tyranny. So call me a moderate cyber optimist.
I'd like to continue a little bit more on this subject and say a few words about Brazil. And what we have here in Brazil, and probably in many other countries, is what I call the paradox of the censorship, democratic censorship. We live in democratic countries, and nonetheless, we have judges that may issue orders for people to remove content from their blogs, and judges that order the removal of any discourse that might be considered harmful from the point of view of the person affected. So that, to me, that configures censorship, even though it's the democratic system. How do you both view, let's start with Larry. Larry, how do you view that, the problem of this paradox in which democratic systems may gradually move towards censorship? Because, of course, when government first introduces legislation to prohibit hateful speech or child pornography, everybody agrees. And they start with very mild provisions, but then they take advantage of that and they increase the penalties and increase the scope of the legislation. And it may seem that we are going through the road of serfdom, as Hayek used to say. How do you see that?
I think it was either Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson who was credited with saying that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Whoever it was who said that, I think, meant that you can't just wind up a democratic system and start it off and then walk away from it. Otherwise, there'll be plenty of people who, given even the slightest bit of power, will use it for their own advantage and against the liberties of others. So you have to keep an eye on government at all times, and even the freest of nations. Liberty is always in danger by those who would seek personal power. I don't know in Brazil if you have anything equivalent to what we call our First Amendment to our Constitution in the United States, but I'm happy to say that for the most part, the First Amendment is one of the few parts of the Constitution that most Americans still believe in and is still widely practiced. We're very intolerant of efforts at censorship. I think that's a healthy atmosphere in any country, to be very skeptical of the use of power by anyone to restrict the speech and the thought of other people. It's down that path that you will find the extinction of democracy and the elevation of political power over ultimately every aspect of life. Must be resisted at all costs.
Well, let's start with basics. The internet is the single biggest advance in free speech the world has seen ever. That's the good news. Now, there is a complicated question. In my view, individuals do have some privacy rights. So there can be cases where my right to privacy may conflict with someone else's right to free speech. It's a very fine line, and I think no one knows where to draw it exactly. And I think the world's governments as a whole, they give too little value to free speech and too much to privacy. But that said, when it comes to problems in the world, I think it's a relatively small one. And I would just stress the basic fact that the actual opportunity to have and exercise free speech has gone up more in the last 10 years by an order of magnitude than in any other period of human history. It took the printing press a long time to have an effect. It is not taking the web a long time to have a big effect.
Now a question to Tyler from Rodrigo Constantino. Brazil is the leader in Orkut and Twitter. I'm not so sure that it's a good thing when Brazil is the leader of something. Don't you think there is a bad side to social networks?
Well, there's a bad side to everything, but you need to ask yourself, is that side a large one or a small one? Social networks are most of all a way to educate yourself, to get a flow of information from your friends rather than from mass media, to have it tailored to what you want, to bring yourself closer to the people you love. It's a way of flirting with other people. It's a way of meeting them to marry them. It's a way sometimes of arguing with other people. Are there crazy people who misuse the internet and social networks? Absolutely. Are those people a very clear minority? Do the overwhelming majority of people on social networks enjoy them, learn from them, find them fulfilling? Absolutely. It's like a market. Most people are voting with their feet. And if Brazilians are voting with their feet onto Orkut and Twitter, in my view, that's a sign of one way in which Brazil is especially advanced.
Now a question from Margaret Say. I understand that the absence of regulation and the lack of interference from the government are essential to the free economy applying on the web too. She believes that should apply to the web too. I fear only the effects on educational policy in the future, as the flow of information on the net is not yet reliable, and the younger generation can be easily manipulated if they do not have the educational foundation as they should have. Any thoughts or suggestions? Let's start with Larry.
Tyler, I think you concluded your remarks by pointing out very properly that there is a need for improvement in education, not only in Brazil, but in the United States and probably just about every country, certainly every country where government has come to dominate the process of education. I recall not so long ago when the debate on school choice first really got underway in the United States. There were people who said, we cannot have more choice among parents as to where to send their children to school because that would lead to some children falling through the cracks and not getting a decent education because their parents might not choose the right school. Well, let me tell you, in the United States, where we have 88% of our population going to government schools, millions of children are falling through the cracks every day because of the absence of choice and competition and accountability in education. Because education has become so monopolized and controlled by not only government bureaucracies, but also by the unions of teachers and other school employees who have bound the management of schools in unsustainable contracts that limit flexibility and raise costs. So probably in both Brazil and the United States, there is a need to demonopolize education, infuse it with the virtues of choice, competition, accountability, give people greater opportunities, rather than consign them to government schools, government universities, and all of the hidebound bureaucracy and regulatory policy that implies.
I would second all of Larry's remarks. I would also add this idea, reliable information. What does that mean? That to me means censorship. Of course, a lot of what's on the internet is wrong, it's false, it's stupid. But I will say this. First, that means no one is controlling it. Second, if you want to check a fact on the internet, check a claim, check a study, it's never been easier than it is today. You just Google something. You check, and the internet will tell you. So if you want reliability, it has never been more available. In the old days of newspapers, 20 years ago, a story would appear, you could never know, never tell. Now you get to read the dissenters, follow the leads, and make up your own mind about what's reliable.
Let me touch now on an issue that is completely different here in Brazil as it is in the US. In the US, you protect anonymity in general. Some of the founding fathers used pseudonyms to publish material. They understood the importance of anonymity because then discussions would be focused on ideas and people would not blackmail other people for being anonymous. And there's also a recent decision by your Supreme Court in the US that says that the protection of anonymous discourse is vital for democracy. Dissidents should be allowed to protect their identities because that will frees them to express critical views defended by minorities. So being anonymous is a protection against the tyranny of the majority. And in Brazil, our constitution expressly prohibits anonymity. And now there are projects, law projects, proposals to, for example, prohibit fake profiles in the internet and other things like that. Everybody that goes to cyber cafes in Brazil have to identify themselves through all the documentations that we need to have. We have national IDs and tax IDs, and everybody has to give those in cyber cafes to identify themselves. That reminds me of a sentence a quote by my father, who used to say that the excessive requirements of bureaucracies, things like that, only serves to make life difficult for the honest people, but not to intimidate the dishonest people who are specialists in falsifying documentations. We've seen in Egypt that one of the leaders of the revolution was an anonymous page in Facebook. We are all Khaled Said. So how do you guys view this question of anonymity in general? Let's start with Larry.
It's not an issue I had given much thought to before, and I didn't know that your Constitution prohibits it. Because I believe in maximum liberty of the individual, I think I would side in favor of anonymity in all but the most extraordinary or exceptional of circumstances. And if I were pressed to think of what such a circumstance would look like, I suppose that if you make an accusation of someone that results in a lawsuit, that accused has a right to know who his accuser is. There's a case where I suppose anonymity at some point you'd have to draw a line. But I would tend to favor the broadest possible application of the rights to anonymity in almost every case that I can think of, as an expression of freedom.
Anonymity is the friend of dissent, and it's the friend of liberty. It's also one reason why so many people move to cities. They want to be able to live their lives and not be watched by their neighbors the entire time. So I'm a big fan of anonymity. It has some limits when it leads to law breaking, but other than that, it should be encouraged. And I'm sorry to hear that its prohibition is in the Brazilian Constitution.
I love the answers.
We love the questions.
There's a question by Eduardo Estima. He said, we have mentioned here at the forum about education, and we also discussed during the morning about WikiLeaks. Then it's a question for Tyler. In your opinion, how much would we benefit or not if the information were more transparent up until total transparency, where nothing would be secret? How do you view that?
Let me just say, people in the Middle East usually love WikiLeaks. There has been a pro-liberty influence of WikiLeaks in the Middle East, and it unroots corruption and rotten governments, and it makes bad news public, and it allows everyone to know that everyone else knows. It makes news of corruption common knowledge, as we economists say. Can there be an ideal of total transparency? I don't think so. I think any corporation or any government, it has to have some secrets. What's really going to happen now because of WikiLeaks is diplomats won't write down very much because they know it will come out. So they'll make a lot more phone calls. This is inefficient, but there will never be a world where everything is transparent. We can think of it as an ideal that we would like to get closer to. I think WikiLeaks has been a very good influence. I think it's a tragedy that Bradley Manning is sitting in jail, essentially being tortured, when he has not yet even been found guilty. So WikiLeaks has changed the world, mostly in a good way.
Would you like to comment a little on that, Larry?
Tyler provides such superlative answers that it's impossible to improve upon them.
Wonderful. Tyler, you mentioned that the internet is hard to tax. And that reminded immediately of Ronald Reagan's quote, if something moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. And that's a wonderful quote. And it reminded me because that quote because in Brazil, we got the impression all the time that we are paying taxes anyhow. Even if you're sitting at your computer and taking advantage of the leisure over the internet, you have paid 60% in taxes for your computer, 40% in taxes for the chair you're sitting on, and of course they would tax. For example, you mentioned the music industry, and they will overtax the bands in shows, in CDs, and everything is around 50% of taxes. How do you put that into perspective?
It's not impossible to tax the internet, but it's harder because a lot of what the internet gives you is fun. So they can tax your computer connection, they can tax your chair, they can tax the apartment you live in. But at the margin, when you use the internet more, when you post another message on Facebook, when you watch another YouTube clip, when you send another email, that is very hard to tax. And economics is about choice at the margin. So at the margin, the hard-to-tax sector is growing. This is good. This is to be expected. And this will continue to help liberty in the future. And in the long run, I like to think it will make the Brazilian economy harder to tax.
Question for Larry. Larry, what happens to the market when it is impeded from trading among itself, among the players in itself? And what are the consequences that this brings to the country or the economy of those barriers?
If you impede trade, you, by definition, push people into accepting a less desirable alternative. If you keep them from doing what they would freely choose in the first place in the absence of that intervention, well, then they will fall back on the next best but less desirable alternative. And you'll produce other consequences as well. Depending on the nature of the intervention, you can send a pretty strong signal to inventors, to innovators, entrepreneurs, to job creators, that those kinds of activities are now too risky for them. Sometimes I'm amazed at how much entrepreneurs still invest and take chances in an economy that so heavily regulates and taxes them, as in Brazil, when they could put what money they have in far safer places like Treasury bills and have a guaranteed return with virtually no risk, and yet they do it anyway. But there is a point at which burdens from government through intervention can create powerful enough disincentives that you shut down the engines of economic growth, namely entrepreneurship, trade, and commerce. So that's why almost every economists differ on a lot of things. But when it comes to the virtue inherent in the process of trade, you can
Larry,
hardly
could you just speak closer to the mic?
Okay, you can hardly be an economist and be opposed to trade. It's a good thing. And when you interfere with trade, you invariably raise costs and force people into less desirable alternatives.
We have two related questions here. The first question is, do we run the risk of having populist politicians due to the lack of job creation that you mentioned, Tyler, that we are now seeing over the internet or technology in general? And the other question says, with the digital and technology market rising, but jobs not rising as much, how will the market solve this equation? Will this provoke statist interventions because of that? Let's start with Tyler.
If we look at the last decade in the United States, there has been no net job creation in our economy. Zero. Furthermore, this is true even if you look at the period prior to the financial crisis. This has me greatly worried. I see in my country a greater polarization of opinion. I think there is a greater chance of getting some extreme populist, inefficient, liberty-restricting outcomes. We've already had some of those in the last 2 years. So in my view, for the United States, it's a very grave danger that we will go the path of Argentina and Greece. And while Brazil is becoming fiscally more sound, we will go in the opposite direction, and there will be discontentment and not enough interest in ideas of liberty, and there is some very real chance that the United States has another financial crisis within the next 10 to 15 years, with some further bad outcomes after that.
Let me comment on at least the first part of that question about the danger of populist politicians. And yes, we do have a danger of falling prey to that sort of thing. I see it all the time. I see politicians or would-be politicians catering to the lowest common denominator among us. People who promise something at other people's expense, promise something for the moment and ignore the long run. The essence of populist demagoguery is promising something to someone to whom it does not belong. And you know what the best defense against that, against a people falling prey to populist demagoguery, is, I think, character. It's character. A people of strong character, namely people who practice such virtues as honesty and self-reliance and patience and courage and who don't mortgage the future of generations yet unborn for their current desire for gratification. People who respect the lives and property of others, they will be the ones who most resist or most resistant to the false promises of populist demagoguery. And if there's one thing I think people of every nation need to cultivate more of than perhaps anything else, it is personal character. It's the most critical element in the defense of our liberties. People whose character dissipates or disappears become putty in the hands of demagogues and tyrants. If you believe in self-government, you must understand that it begins closest to home. It means you have to govern yourself. It means you have to maintain the highest possible character so you don't fall prey to demagogues. History has shown time and again that when you lose your character, people that do that will lose their liberties as a consequence.
Well, there's a question from Einstein do Nascimento, who is part of this, the Austrian School of Economics study group at São Paulo, at the University of São Paulo. He's asking, more and more companies are selling more but hiring less people, and only the most qualified people got a job. So in a country such as Brazil, in which you have a great number of functional illiterate people, what are your suggestions for the individuals and the market to solve this problem without resorting to the government, which is our greater enemy?
Well, there's something in economics that is called the law of demand. At higher prices, people buy less. At lower prices, people buy more. When your government policies impose ever higher costs upon job creators, people who hire people, when it imposes ever higher costs on the very aspect of hiring, fewer people will be hired. And in Brazil, as in, say, much of Western Europe, there's this idea that we can somehow help people and further their likely employment if we saddle the employer with all kinds of requirements that they do this, do that, ending up costing as much in some cases in the non-payroll costs of hiring someone than in the actual wages paid out. The problem with that is that when you make it more difficult, more costly to hire, there will be fewer people hired. Fewer people have the opportunity to start up the rungs of the economic ladder. You make it difficult to close a factory, you, at the same time, make it less likely that somebody will open one. So stop making the costs of employing people so massive, so high, that people stop taking the risks to do that. And you'll accomplish more to help people than all the welfare programs to address the problem that you could possibly dream up.
Tyler?
I think this is very much about education. And as Larry and I both said before, I very much favor educational choice. But in the meantime, there is a recipe for better education. It's pay the good teachers more, insist on quality, fire the bad teachers, give high social status to teachers, and have parents support the educational enterprise at home every night. And a country which does those, even with government schools, can succeed in having a pretty good educational system. So in the meantime, before whatever expansion of markets we see in education, that's what I think my country should do, and probably it's also what your country should do.
Then I have a comment. Let me interrupt you for a second. From my understanding, Tyler, the logic of government is the opposite of the logic of the private market. In the private market, when you offer a better product, you get more revenue. While in the government, and also in education by the government, when you provide a worse product, then you get more revenue, because then you say, we need more money to solve this problem. We need more money from the government. So it's completely the other way around. How do you see that? Do you think, the question is, how do you think that the government running schools can be as efficient as the private market when you were under that sort of logic?
I'm not saying government can be as efficient, but let's look around the globe. Look at South Korea, look at Finland, look at Singapore. Those are commonly considered the 3 best educational systems in the world at the lower levels. All 3 of those are run by government. We may not like to admit it, but there are a lot of governmental systems in the world which work not as well as I would like, but they work fairly well. About half of the schools in my country work pretty well, and a lot of those are run by governments. There are public universities which are run by governments, some of which are quite good. So that choice and private involvement work better, I understand. But if we ask the question, is improving education under government hopeless? It absolutely is not. There's a lot government can do. In the meantime, government should be doing it. It's a very good investment. I'm not predicting it will happen, but has it been done many times in many other places? Clearly the answer is yes.
Tyler mentioned that half the government schools in the United States are doing all right. Can you imagine applying a similar standard, let's say, to flying airplanes? If we said, well, only half the planes crash, that's pretty good. I would say you've got a lot of room for improvement. And the problem is with government, whenever it steps into something, it rarely can fail in a sense that it can go out of business and be punished thereby because of its poor performance. Some years ago, the CEO of Eastern Airlines, which is no longer around, and former astronaut Frank Borman put it well when he said that capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. And he was observing the fact that when in a system you can fail, go out of business, be punished for poor performance on the spot, it tends to improve performance. But with government, its failure can go on and on and on and on, and it's very difficult to get rid of it because it's institutionalized. The harm that it does is maximized and generalized across the population. That's an argument for keeping it small in the first place, because that's the very essence of government in the first instance.
I would like to jump in the discussion again and propose an acid test of this conjecture that the government may have a better or similar quality as the private sector in education. If the government believes that, then it should make it voluntary so people could choose to pay their taxes to fund education. And of course, the governments never do that. So that must be a reason why they don't do that. And I would suggest it is because they are not as efficient as a private market. Otherwise, they wouldn't be scared of letting people pay voluntarily. We don't have any more time. I would like to thank Larry and Tyler for this wonderful debate. Thank you.